No lawyer. You're done. Craig Greer said it loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. A few people in the back chuckled. Douglas Greer, his father, crossed his arms, smiling like a man who already knew the outcome. Attorney Martin Lawford sat beside them, casually spinning his pen the ease of someone who had never lost. On the other side, Tessa sat alone. No lawyer, no family, no one. Lawford stood, his voice polite but firm. Your Honor, the plaintiff requests the court reconsider the defendant's self-representation. Miss Greer holds no law degree and has no litigation experience. Craig glanced at Tessa with a half-smile. Judge Ruth Caldwell didn't respond immediately. She opened a thick file, not the case file. She read, turned a page, kept reading. The room grew quiet. Lawford glanced at his own copy, and his expression shifted. Craig frowned. What is it? Lawford didn't answer. He read one more page, then set his pen down. Judge Caldwell looked up. Mr. Lawford, I suggest you focus on the case rather than worrying about your opponent. This file shows Miss Greer is fully capable of representing herself. Craig turned to his father. Douglas was no longer smiling. And Tessa, she sat still, her expression unchanged, as if she had known this moment would come. But to understand why a woman with no law degree, no family, and not a single ally made the most expensive lawyer in the city lose face in 30 seconds, you need to know how Tessa Greer lived before she walked into this courtroom. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. Thank you for being here. Tessa Greer didn't grow up in a wealthy family. She didn't grow up in an ordinary family either. In truth, most of Tessa's childhood had only two people in it, herself and her mother. Her father left when Tessa was still too young to remember his face. No explanation, no phone call, no child support. One morning he was still at home, by afternoon he wasn't, and from that day on, Tessa never heard anyone mention him again. Her mother, Linda, was a worker at a packing factory on the outskirts of the city. Every day, she went to work before the sky had even begun to lighten, and came home when Tessa was already asleep. Her wages were enough to pay the rent on their one-bedroom apartment, enough to buy food for the two of them, enough for Tessa to have books and school supplies. But they were never enough for anything else. Linda didn't complain. She didn't tell anyone how hard her life was. She simply worked, came home, cooked dinner, asked Tessa how school was going, then went back to sleep so she could repeat it all the next morning. For 18 straight years, she kept that rhythm without breaking once, until her body couldn't bear it anymore. Tessa's mother died of illness just before Tessa's 18th birthday. There wasn't time for many last words, no time for any grand instructions. Tessa sat beside the hospital bed and held her mother's hand until that hand went cold. Then she stepped out into the hallway and cried until there were no tears left. The funeral took place on a rainy afternoon. 7 people attended. Tessa stood beside the coffin, 18 years old, and understood that from that moment on, she was completely alone in the world. The first night after the funeral, Tessa returned to the rented apartment. It was so empty that the sound of her footsteps echoed back from the walls. Tessa didn't turn on the living room light. She went straight into the kitchen, sat down on the floor, and leaned her back against the old refrigerator. In front of her was a box of instant noodles, the cheapest kind in the supermarket, and $47 rolled up inside the cloth wallet her mother had left on the shelf. That was everything Tessa had. $47, a box of noodles, and an apartment that would be taken back if she didn't pay the rent by the end of the month. She didn't cry. Not because she was strong, but because she had cried herself dry at the hospital, and there was nothing left in her to cry with. Tessa sat there for a very long time, staring at the box of noodles on the floor, and then she said to herself, in a voice so soft even she could barely hear it, "Mom raised me alone for 18 years. The least I can do is keep myself alive." She stood up, boiled water, opened the box of noodles, and ate every bite. Then she washed the bowl, wiped the table, and sat down to write a list of places that were hiring. That was how Tessa Greer stepped into adult life. Not through some great turning point, but through a box of instant noodles and the decision not to collapse. In the years that followed, Tessa took any job that could earn her money, washing dishes in restaurants, helping in kitchens on the night shift, cleaning offices in the early morning. There were months when she worked 3 jobs at once, slept less than 4 hours a night, and ate leftover restaurant meals she brought home. No one helped her. No one checked on her. and Tessa didn't expect anyone to check on her either. She learned that the world didn't owe her anything, and the only way to survive was to keep walking on her own. At 21 years old, Tessa saw a hiring notice for caregivers at Maplewood, an upscale nursing home on the north side of the city. The pay was decent, there was insurance, and the shifts were suitable enough for her to work while attending evening classes. She applied, interviewed, and was hired. The work wasn't anything extraordinary. Tessa helped the elderly residents eat, walk, and take their medicine on time. She did the job well, because she was used to hardship and never complained. But Tessa didn't know that 3 months after the day she started working at Maplewood, a man would walk into that nursing home and change her life completely. His name was Walter Greer. Walter Greer entered Maplewood Nursing Home on a June morning, 3 months after Tessa had started working there. He was 79 years old, tall and thin, with snow-white hair, walking slowly but still keeping his back straight. The car that brought him there was a glossy black sedan, and the driver wore a suit and carried 2 leather suitcases. A few employees began whispering the moment he stepped through the door. Everyone knew the name Walter Greer. He was the founder of the Greer real estate empire, the owner of dozens of commercial buildings, apartment complexes, and shopping centers stretching along the east coast of America. His fortune was valued at millions of dollars. Some said even more than that, but Walter never confirmed it. He simply walked into the room, set down his suitcases, looked around once, then sat in the chair beside the window. He said nothing. During those first days, the Maplewood staff treated Walter in 2 different ways. Some were polite, but kept their distance, the kind of politeness reserved for a wealthy man they didn't want to get involved with. Others did the opposite, becoming overly warm, smiling more than necessary, asking him whether he needed anything 4 or 5 times in a single hour. Walter saw through both kinds. He had spent his whole life among people who wanted something from him. Partners wanted money. Employees wanted promotions. Relatives wanted inheritance. Friends wanted connections. He was used to it, and he was tired of it. During the first week, he hardly spoke to anyone. His son, Douglas, called exactly once, said a few words, then hung up. His grandson Craig didn't call. No one came to visit. Walter sat on the porch every afternoon, reading the financial newspaper, drinking black coffee without sugar, and looking out at the front lawn as though he were looking at something very far away. Tessa noticed Walter not because he was rich. She didn't know he was rich, at least not during that first week. She only saw an old man sitting alone too often. Tessa's job was to care for the residents on the 2nd floor, and Walter was on the 3rd, so she wasn't directly responsible for him. But every afternoon, when her shift ended, Tessa walked past the porch and saw Walter sitting there, alone. Every single day. Most of the other employees would ask, "Do you need anything?" Or, "Are you feeling all right?" And then keep walking. Tessa didn't ask. One afternoon, she simply sat down in the chair beside him. She said nothing. She didn't look at him. She just sat there, looking out at the lawn, as if she too needed a quiet place after a long shift. 10 minutes passed. Walter was the first to speak. "Do you know what the worst thing is about having a lot of money?" Tessa turned to look at him. She waited. Walter kept looking straight ahead, his voice calm, but something heavy lying underneath it. "Never knowing who truly loves you." That sentence hung in the air for a while. Tessa didn't rush to answer. She thought. Then she said softly, "I don't know how much money you have, but I know you like black coffee without sugar, and every morning you read the newspaper from the last page back to the front." Walter turned to look at her. His eyes changed. Not with surprise. It was something closer to relief, the kind of relief that belongs to someone who hasn't been seen for a very long time, without anyone calculating what they might gain. He smiled. A small smile, a little tired, but real. The Maplewood staff later said that was the first time they had seen Walter Greer smile since he had entered the nursing home. From that afternoon on, everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just 2 people beginning to sit beside each other every afternoon. Walter told Tessa about the early days of building his career, when all he had was an old pickup truck and enough money to put a deposit on a small piece of land. Tessa told him about her mother, about the years when she worked 3 jobs at the same time, about the cloth wallet with $47 inside. Neither of them pitied the other. They simply listened to each other. And in Walter Greer's world, where everyone wanted something from him, a person who only wanted to sit beside him and listen was the most precious thing he had ever found. Little by little, Walter began asking Tessa about her future, whether she wanted to go to school, whether she wanted to do something else with her life. Tessa said she wanted to study finance and corporate law, but tuition wasn't something she could afford right then. Walter didn't give her money. He never gave her money directly. Instead, a few weeks later, Tessa received a letter from an educational charity foundation, informing her that she qualified for a full scholarship. That foundation had been established by Walter many years earlier to support students from difficult backgrounds. Tessa wasn't stupid. She knew who stood behind that decision. But she also understood that Walter had deliberately done it this way, so she wouldn't feel indebted, so she would know that the scholarship was something she deserved, not something that had simply been handed to her. On another afternoon on the porch, a few months after they had come to know each other, Walter said something to Tessa that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The strongest person in the room isn't the one who speaks the loudest. It's the one who knows how to wait. Tessa looked at him, gave a small nod, and wrote that sentence into her memory. Many years later, when she sat alone in a courtroom facing an entire family that wanted to crush her, that sentence was what kept her sitting still, kept her calm, and kept her from falling apart. With the scholarship certificate in her hand, Tessa left Maplewood to study full-time, but she still visited Walter every weekend. She chose finance and corporate law, not because she loved money, but because she understood that money was the language of power. And if she didn't want anyone to push her down, she had to learn how to read that language. During 4 years of college, Tessa studied while working part-time in the evenings. She graduated with nearly the highest grades in her class. No one in the Greer family knew. No one asked. And Tessa didn't need anyone to ask. Right after graduation, she was hired by an auditing firm that specialized in investigating financial fraud. The work wasn't glamorous. Tessa sat in rooms piled high with files, reading thousands of pages of bank statements, tracing every dollar as it flowed through shell companies so complicated that even lawyers had to get headaches over them. She worked quietly, precisely, without mistakes. In 7 years in the field, Tessa took part in the investigation of a series of federal-level fraud cases, analyzed cross-border cash flows, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies many times. Her professional record grew thicker year after year, filled with accomplishments that would make any outsider stop and read carefully. But the Greer family weren't outsiders. They were people who had never bothered to look. Douglas Greer, Walter's only son, was 59 years old and managed the entire legal side of the family's real estate empire. Douglas wasn't a builder. He was an heir. Walter had built everything, and Douglas only had to sit in the chair and keep the wheel turning. The only thing Douglas truly poured his heart into was his son, Craig Greer. Craig was 31, tall, expensively dressed, confident when he spoke, always wearing the expression of a man who believed the world owed him something. Douglas called Craig the future of the Greer family, the one who would raise the empire to a new height. In reality, the opposite was entirely true. Craig failed in business again and again. Every project he launched ended in losses, debts piling up from terrible financial decisions he never once admitted were wrong. And every time Craig fell, Douglas stepped in to save him. Where did the money come from? Walter's money. Douglas withdrew it from the trust fund his father had established, again and again, paying off Craig's debts, then giving Craig more capital so he could fail one more time. Walter knew. He said nothing, but he knew. And Tessa, in the eyes of Douglas and Craig, didn't exist. It wasn't that they hated her. Hatred would have required them to spend effort thinking about her. They simply didn't care who she was. Whenever Tessa came to Maplewood on weekends to visit Walter, she sometimes ran into Douglas or Craig in the hallway. Douglas would look at her, then look away, the kind of look reserved for service staff he didn't need to remember. Craig didn't even bother to look. Once, Tessa was sitting on the porch with Walter when Craig stepped outside. He glanced at Tessa from head to toe, turned to Douglas, who was walking behind him, and asked loudly enough for Tessa to hear, "Who did the old man hire?" Douglas didn't answer. He only waved a hand, signaling him to go inside. No one asked Tessa her name. No one asked what she did for a living. No one asked where she had studied, what she was good at, or how she was living. In Douglas and Craig's world, Tessa was only a shadow passing through the hallway of a nursing home, not worth remembering, not worth worrying about. They didn't know she had a degree in finance and corporate law. They didn't know she had taken part in investigations of fraud cases that would make even their lawyers become careful the moment they heard the names. They didn't know that every weekend, When Tessa sat on the porch listening to Walter tell his stories, she was also telling him about her work. And Walter listened, nodded, and smiled. He knew how brilliant his granddaughter was. He knew how strong she was. And he knew that one day, the people who looked down on her would pay the price for their own ignorance. It would be the biggest mistake Douglas and Craig Greer had ever made. But at that moment, they didn't know. And even if someone had told them, they wouldn't have believed it. But this story didn't belong only to Tessa and the Greer family. There was another man, living in an entirely different world, yet tied to Walter Greer by the same invisible thread. His name was Barrett Kincaid. At 33 years old, Barrett was the head of the Kincaid organization, an underground empire that controlled much of the illegal finance, real estate, and logistics activity along the east coast of America. No one knew exactly how large the Kincaid organization truly was, because Barrett never left behind a clear trail. On the outside, he was a real estate investment businessman. On the inside, he was the kind of man whose name, once spoken, made conference rooms fall silent and made people begin reconsidering every decision they had made. Barrett wasn't the kind of man who spoke much. He was tall, solidly built, wore a black suit almost all the time, and on his left wrist he always wore an old watch, its crystal scratched and clouded with age. That watch had once belonged to his father. It was the only thing left from his old life. 14 years earlier, Barrett had been only 19 years old. His father, Raymond Kincaid, was the man who had built the organization from the ground up, a hard man who still believed in loyalty. Raymond's greatest mistake was trusting the wrong person. His closest ally, a man named Garrett Holloway, betrayed him. One night, everything collapsed. Accounts were frozen, partners turned their backs, and Raymond's people were bought off one by one. Raymond lost everything. He disappeared from all that he had once built, and Barrett, 19 years old, suddenly found himself standing in the ashes with no one beside him. Barrett had to survive from nothing. No money, no home, no allies. He lived day to day by hiding in abandoned industrial districts, sleeping in cars, and eating from the trash bins behind restaurants. One winter night, Barrett climbed over a fence into an unfinished construction site on the outskirts of the city, looking for shelter. He was wounded in the shoulder, so exhausted he could barely stand, and he sat curled into a corner of the basement. The next morning, an older man walked into the construction site. He wore a wool coat and leather shoes, with architectural blueprints in his hand. It was Walter Greer. The construction site belonged to one of his real estate projects. Walter saw Barrett sitting in the corner, his shoulder soaked with blood, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He didn't call security. He didn't ask who Barrett was, which organization he belonged to, or why he was there. Walter simply looked at him for a while and said, "You need a doctor." Barrett didn't answer. Walter left. 1 hour later, he returned with food, water, and an envelope. Inside the envelope was cash, the address of a cheap rooming house in the nearby neighborhood, and the business card of a lawyer. Walter set the envelope down beside Barrett. "I don't know what happened to you, but if you need a place to stay and someone to give you legal advice, this is where you start." Then he walked out, without turning back, without asking for a name. Barrett picked up that envelope and looked at it for a very long time. It was the first time in many months that someone had given him something without demanding anything in return. Barrett never forgot Walter Greer. He didn't go back to find him, didn't call to thank him, didn't write a letter. But from that day on, every time Barrett made an important decision, he asked himself whether the old man from that construction site would have nodded. For 14 years, Barrett rebuilt everything from empty hands. No one helped him. No one showed him the way. He learned how to read people, read money, and read power. He found, one by one, the men who had remained loyal to his father, gathered them back together, and built the Kincaid organization into a force even Holloway had to treat with caution. Barrett ruled through silence. He didn't shout, didn't make loud threats, didn't lose his temper. One evening, inside the VIP room of an upscale restaurant, a businessman who owed the Kincaid organization a large sum sat across from Barrett, sweat beading on his forehead, his mouth constantly explaining why the payment was late. Barrett sat still, his hand turning his father's old watch on the table. The businessman had spoken only half a sentence when Barrett raised one finger. Just one finger. The man stopped speaking in the middle of his words. Barrett looked straight into his eyes, his voice low. "I don't listen to excuses. I listen to solutions." The businessman swallowed, stayed silent for 3 seconds, then lowered his head. 2 weeks. Barrett nodded once, stood up, walked out. No handshake, no glance back. Because the head of the Kincaid organization didn't need anyone to confirm his power. That power existed in every second of his silence. But there was one thing Barrett still hadn't finished dealing with. Garrett Holloway, the man who had betrayed his father 14 years earlier, was coming back. Holloway hadn't disappeared after overthrowing Raymond Kincaid. He had built his own underground financial empire, quietly and patiently. Through all those years, Holloway had watched Barrett from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment. And now, with Walter Greer, the man who had once held enough influence to make Holloway cautious, already dead, Holloway considered this the moment to strike. He began buying off people inside the Kincaid organization, one by one, as quietly as a snake crawling through the dark. Barrett didn't yet know exactly who was betraying him, but he could feel that something was wrong. The money didn't match the books. Information was leaking in places where it shouldn't have leaked, and Barrett Kincaid, the man who had lost his father to betrayal, understood better than anyone that the most dangerous enemy never came from outside. The call came at 2 o'clock in the morning. Tessa was sitting at the desk in her small apartment, documents piled around her, her eyes red from staying up late. Her phone vibrated. Maplewood's number. She answered and heard the voice of a familiar nurse, trembling. "Tessa, Mr. Walter has had a stroke. You should come right away." Tessa didn't remember how she drove to the hospital. She only remembered running down the hallway, pushing open the emergency room door, and seeing Walter lying on the bed, smaller than she had ever seen him before. He had always been the man who sat with his back straight, who spoke slowly but firmly, who looked at people as though he could see straight through them. But now, lying among the IV lines and the steady beeping of machines, he was simply an 82-year-old man who was tired. Tessa pulled a chair beside the bed and took his hand. Walter's hand was cold, but he still tried to squeeze hers. His eyes opened, looking at her, and Tessa saw no fear in them, only the calmness of a man who had lived long enough to have nothing left to hold back. They sat that way for a very long time. No one said anything. The steady beeping of the machines filled the room. Then Walter spoke, his voice so weak that Tessa had to lean close to hear him. "You never needed anyone to recognize you." He stopped, breathed, then went on. "That's why I trust you." Tessa bit her lip. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that he had changed her life, that without him she would still be washing dishes on the night shift, that every afternoon they had spent sitting on the porch was among the most precious moments she had ever had. But her throat closed. She only nodded, tightened her grip around his hand, and hoped he understood everything she couldn't say. Walter closed his eyes. His hand was still holding hers. Tessa sat beside his bed all night, without sleeping, without leaving, without letting go. When dawn slipped through the curtains, the heartbeat on the monitor began to slow. Then it stopped. Walter Greer passed away at 6:17 in the morning, in a quiet hospital room, with his hand resting in the hand of the only person who had truly loved him for who he was, not for the fortune he owned. The funeral was held 3 days later. Craig sat in the front row, his eyes fixed on his phone throughout the service. Douglas stood at the funeral home entrance, shaking hands with everyone who came to pay their respects, wearing a polite social smile, more like a host greeting guests at a party than a son saying goodbye to his father. Tessa stood beside the coffin in silence, one hand resting on the edge of the wood, her eyes fixed on the face of the old man who had changed her life. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't hurting, but because she had promised herself she wouldn't fall apart in front of people who were treating Walter's death like a procedure that needed to be handled. More than 100 miles away, in a penthouse on the top floor of a building in the heart of the city, Barrett Kincaid was sitting behind his desk. In front of him were 3 monitors, an untouched glass of whiskey, and a thick stack of documents. The door opened. The man who stepped in was Neil, Barrett's right hand, the only person allowed to enter his office without knocking first. Neil stopped in front of the desk, stood straight, his voice calm but careful. "Mr. Walter Greer passed away this morning." Barrett didn't react right away. The pen in his hand stopped in midair. He set it down on the desk, slowly, then turned his chair toward the glass wall behind him. The city stretched out below, cars moving like tiny dots, the building across from him reflecting sunlight. Barrett looked outside, but he saw nothing at all. He was looking back 14 years. An unfinished construction site, an old man in a wool coat, an envelope, and the words, "I don't know what happened to you, But if you need a place to stay and someone to give you legal advice, this is where you start. The only person who had ever helped Barrett without demanding anything in return. And now that man was gone. Neil waited. He knew that when Barrett stayed silent that long, he shouldn't say another word. 1 minute passed, then 2. Barrett didn't turn his chair back. He spoke, his voice low, his eyes still facing the glass. He has a granddaughter. Her name is Tessa. From now on, anything related to her, I want to know. Neil didn't ask why. He didn't ask who Tessa was, how important she might be, or how far Barrett wanted to go to protect her. He only nodded. Understood. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. Barrett remained seated there, looking out over the city, his hand turning the old watch on his wrist. In his world, everything had a price. Loyalty had a price, betrayal had a price, and a life saved 14 years earlier. That debt was something Barrett Kincaid had never forgotten. 1 week after the funeral, Tessa received a call from the office of Walter's probate attorney. The attorney's voice was polite and brief. He requested that everyone connected to Walter Greer's estate be present on Thursday afternoon for the reading of the will. Tessa arrived on time. She wore the only business suit she owned and sat in the corner of the conference room, far from the main table. Douglas and Craig were already seated. Douglas sat at the head of the table, one leg crossed over the other, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood, wearing the expression of a man waiting to receive what belonged to him. Craig sat beside him, leaning back in his chair, scrolling through his phone and yawning now and then. Neither of them looked at Tessa when she walked in. The attorney, a man of about 60 named Harrison, opened his briefcase and began to read. The first part held nothing unusual. Several charitable donations, a few personal belongings left to old friends, a small sum for the Maplewood staff. Douglas gave a faint nod, waiting patiently for the main portion. Craig was still looking at his phone. Then Attorney Harrison turned to the next page, and his voice slowed by 1 beat. The majority of Mr. Walter Greer's remaining assets, including his entire investment portfolio, his commercial and residential real estate holdings, and the main trust account, shall pass to Miss Tessa Greer. The room went silent. Not an ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that felt as if all the air had been pulled out of the room. Craig looked up from his phone. He looked at the attorney, then at Douglas, then burst out laughing. A short, sharp laugh, the kind that came from someone who thought he had just heard a good joke. What? Are you serious? Attorney Harrison didn't laugh. He looked at Craig, then at Douglas, then back at the document. I am entirely serious. This is Mr. Walter Greer's lawful final wish, drafted and notarized according to proper procedure. The smile vanished from Craig's face. He looked toward Tessa, for the first time that day, as if he had only just realized she was also sitting in the room. Douglas had not been smiling from the beginning. His face shifted from calm to slowly reddening, like water beginning to boil. He looked at the attorney. Say that again. Harrison read it again, word by word, line by line. An investment portfolio worth millions of dollars. Real estate spread across 3 states. The trust account. All of it belonged to Tessa, a person with no shared blood, no shared family line, no flesh and blood claim as a child or grandchild. Douglas shot to his feet. His chair slid backward, scraping across the wooden floor with a harsh, piercing sound. He pointed straight at Tessa, his finger trembling with rage. You manipulated him. Tessa looked directly into Douglas's eyes. She didn't step back, didn't lower her head, didn't blink. Do you really believe that? Douglas took 1 step toward her, his voice rising into a growl. Who are you? You're just the help. You took advantage of an old man who was no longer in his right mind and manipulated his will. Attorney Harrison stood up and raised 1 hand. Mr. Greer, I suggest you calm down. This is a law office, not... Douglas turned on Harrison. You shut up. You know this will is absurd. An outsider, no family, no blood relation, takes everything my father owned? What court do you think is going to accept that? Craig had risen to his feet beside his father. He said nothing, but his eyes looked at Tessa with a hatred she had never seen from anyone, not even from the people she had investigated in her work. Tessa didn't answer Douglas. She didn't explain, didn't defend herself, didn't beg. She stood, picked up the copy of the will attorney Harrison had prepared for her, folded it, and placed it inside her bag. Then she walked out of the room, her back straight, her steps even. The The door closed behind her. Inside, Douglas was still shouting. Attorney Harrison waited until he stopped, before adding one more thing. Mr. Greer, I have a duty to inform you that Mr. Walter also left a private letter for you. However, under Mr. Walter's instructions, this letter is to be opened only in the event of a legal dispute involving the will. Douglas looked at Harrison, his eyes bloodshot. What letter? I don't need a letter. I need a lawyer. Harrison gave a slight nod and closed the file. That is your right. 3 weeks later, Douglas and Craig Greer officially filed a lawsuit in court. The complaint was more than 40 pages long, drafted by attorney Martin Lawford, one of the most expensive litigators in the city. It accused Tessa Greer of coercion, fraud, elder manipulation, and asked the court to declare Walter Greer's entire will invalid. Lawford was confident. Douglas was confident. Craig was more confident than both of them put together, because he believed that a woman with no money, no lawyer, and no family would collapse in the very first round. Then the news arrived. Tessa Greer notified the court that she would represent herself. No hired attorney, no one to defend her, alone. When Douglas heard it, he laughed for the first time since the day the will was read. Craig laughed even louder. And on the first morning of the trial, when father and son entered the courtroom, Craig leaned toward Tessa, bared his teeth in a grin, and spoke loudly enough for the whole room to hear. No lawyer, you're finished. But Craig Greer wasn't the kind of man who could sit still and wait for a court to decide. He wanted to end everything before the trial even began. In Craig's mind, the calculation was very simple. Tessa was a woman with no family, no relatives, no lawyer. If she withdrew on her own, gave up her inheritance rights, then there would be no trial at all. And the fastest way to make someone give up was to make them afraid. One night, about 10 days before the trial, Tessa left the auditing firm later than usual. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and the parking lot was almost empty. She walked quickly toward her old car, her keys already in her hand, the habit of someone used to walking alone at night. She noticed right away that something was wrong. A black SUV was parked across the exit of the narrow alley beside the parking lot. The lights were off. The engine was still running. Tessa hadn't had time to turn back before 2 men stepped out of the vehicle. Both were large, wearing dark coats, walking toward her with steady steps. Not hurried, but not slow either. The man in front held up a stack of papers. Miss Greer, we need you to sign this. Tessa stopped. Her eyes moved to the papers, then to the 2 men, then to the SUV blocking the way. She knew those were papers renouncing her inheritance rights. She didn't need to read them to know. Her hand trembled. She could feel every finger going a little cold, a little shaky, the kind of shaking the body makes when the mind realizes it's standing inside danger. But her voice didn't shake. Tessa looked straight at the man holding the papers. Do you know what I do for a living? The 2 men glanced at each other. They didn't answer. Tessa went on. I investigate financial fraud. Every day, I sit across from people hiding hundreds of millions of dollars. People with walls of lawyers and political power behind them, and they still lose. She took 1 step forward, only 1 step, but it was enough to keep the 2 men from moving any closer. If I don't sign, what are you going to do? Force me? Tomorrow I'll go to court, and the judge will ask what happened tonight. Who do you think will be in trouble? The man holding the papers lowered his hand. His eyes flicked toward the other man. Both of them hesitated. Not because they were afraid of Tessa, but because, for the first time, they realized the woman standing in front of them wasn't the kind of person who would collapse just because she was threatened in a dark alley. At that exact moment, a black sedan slowly pulled up at the mouth of the alley behind them. Its headlights shone straight onto the backs of the 2 men. 2 car doors opened, and 2 figures stepped out, standing still beside the car. They said nothing. They didn't move closer. They only stood there. The 2 men threatening Tessa looked toward the sedan, then at each other, then back at Tessa. Then they stepped back. Quickly, without saying another word, both men got into the SUV and drove away in less than 10 seconds. Tessa stood alone in the alley, her heart beating fast, her hand still trembling, but her legs still holding firm. She looked toward the black sedan. The 2 men had already gotten back into the car and driven away, as quietly as they had arrived. Tessa didn't know who they were. She didn't know who had sent them. She only knew someone was watching, and tonight, she wasn't completely alone. 2 days later, in an empty bar on the south side of the city, Barrett Kincaid sat at the last table, his back against the wall, his eyes on the door. Across from him sat a middle-aged man, the same man who had held the stack of papers in the dark alley that night. The man couldn't sit still. His eyes kept darting to both sides, and his fingers tapped against his thigh. Barrett said nothing for the first 2 minutes. He only sat there, looking at the man across from him, letting the silence do its work. Then Barrett pushed a thin file across the table. Inside were only 2 pages. The first page was the man's home address. The second page listed where he worked, his license plate number, and his daily routine. The man looked at the file, his face turning pale. Barrett spoke, his voice low, calm, not rising by even half a tone. "I'm not threatening you. I only want you to know that I know who you are, where you live, who hired you, and how much you were paid." Barrett pulled the file back, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the pocket of his suit jacket. "From now on, whenever anyone mentions Tessa Greer, you tell them exactly 1 sentence." The man swallowed. "What sentence?" Barrett stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked down at the man across from him. "She isn't alone." Then he walked out without looking back. Barrett's 2 men followed, and the bar door closed behind them, leaving the man sitting alone with 2 untouched glasses and a heartbeat that still hadn't returned to normal. 3 days after the night in the alley, Tessa received a message from an unknown number. No name, no greeting, just one brief line. "The coffee shop at the corner of Vine and 8th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There's something you need to know." Tessa stared at that message for a very long time. Her professional instinct told her she shouldn't meet a stranger in an unclear place, especially after what had happened in the dark alley. But that same instinct also told her the person who had sent this message wasn't one of Craig's people. If Craig wanted to threaten her again, he wouldn't send her a text inviting her out for coffee. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Tessa pushed the door open and stepped into the shop. It was small and quiet, with only a few customers scattered around. She looked around and saw him immediately. A man was sitting at the last table, close to the wall, his back against the corner, his eyes fixed directly on the door. Black suit, neatly combed hair, an old watch on his left wrist. In front of him was a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. Barrett Kincaid. Tessa didn't know who he was, but she recognized at once that this man wasn't ordinary. Not because of the way he dressed, because of the way he sat. The way someone sits when he always knows exactly who has come through the door, who is looking at him, and where the nearest exit is. Tessa sat down across from him, placed her purse on her lap, and didn't order a drink. She looked straight into Barrett's eyes. "Who are you?" Barrett didn't answer right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out a small piece of paper folded in half, and pushed it across the table. Tessa looked down at the paper but didn't pick it up. "Open it," Barrett said, his voice low and calm. Tessa opened the paper. Written on it was the name of a company, Ridgemont Holdings, and beneath it were 4 transaction dates, written by hand in small, clear lettering. Tessa finished reading, then looked up. "What is this?" Barrett leaned back. "Mr. Walter saved me once. Back then, I had nothing left. This is a lead. Douglas Greer withdrew money from Mr. Walter's trust fund and moved it through this company. Check it yourself." Tessa folded the paper again, set it on the table, and looked at Barrett. Her eyes didn't soften, didn't fill with gratitude, didn't show fear, only calculation. "What do you want?" Barrett looked straight at her. He didn't dodge, didn't smile, didn't put on a mysterious face. "Nothing. I'm repaying a debt." 3 seconds of silence passed. Tessa picked up the paper, stood, and slung her purse over her shoulder. Before walking away, she stopped and said, without turning back to look at him, "I don't need anyone to save me." Barrett tilted his head slightly, watching her back. Then he said, just loud enough for her to hear, "I know. He said the same thing about you." Tessa stopped for half a beat. Then she kept walking toward the door. She didn't turn around, but Barrett knew those words had touched her, because her shoulders stiffened for one brief moment before the door closed behind her. The night before the trial, Tessa's small apartment looked like a miniature war room. Her dining table had become a work desk days earlier. Documents were stacked on top of one another. Bank statements stretched across the tabletop, and notes were pasted all over the wall above it. Her laptop glowed open, beside 3 empty coffee cups, and a 4th cup slowly going cold. Tessa had been awake almost continuously for 3 nights. Not because she was anxious, because she was following the lead Barrett had given her, Ridgemont Holdings. She traced the company name through the public business registration system, compared it with the statements from Walter's trust account that Attorney Harrison had provided through litigation procedure, and discovered an unusual flow of money moving from the trust fund through that shell company. Douglas had withdrawn money. It wasn't a small amount, and it hadn't been disclosed. Tessa didn't yet know who owned Ridgemont Holdings, but she knew that money trail wasn't clean. With 7 years of experience investigating fraud, she knew exactly where to look next. She only needed more time. Near 3 o'clock in the morning, Tessa stood up, went into the bathroom, and turned on the light. She looked at herself in the mirror. Dark circles under her eyes, tangled hair, pale skin from lack of sleep. She looked exhausted, but in those eyes, behind that layer of fatigue, there was something that couldn't be shaken. In the corner of the mirror, held in place by a small piece of tape, was a photograph. The only photograph Tessa had with Walter. It had been taken on the Maplewood porch on an autumn afternoon, with the phone of the nurse on duty. In the picture, Walter was sitting in his familiar chair, and Tessa was sitting beside him. Both of them were smiling. Tessa looked at that photograph for a very long time. Then she spoke softly, only loud enough for herself to hear. "I won't let them trample on your final wish." She turned off the bathroom light, returned to the work table, sat down, and reopened the file. Outside the window, the city was still asleep, but Tessa Greer wasn't. She worked until the first light of morning slipped through the curtains. Then she closed her laptop, stood, changed her clothes, picked up the old leather briefcase filled with documents, and stepped out of the apartment. The trial would begin in 3 hours, and Tessa Greer was ready. After Judge Caldwell denied Lawford's motion challenging Tessa's right to represent herself, the trial officially began. Lawford didn't let the momentum slip for long. He straightened his tie, opened his briefcase, and moved into his presentation with the confidence of a man who had been preparing carefully for weeks. The first witness to take the stand was a man of about 65, an old friend of the Greer family who had known Walter for more than 10 years. Lawford guided the questions smoothly, step by step, layer by layer. The witness testified that in the final years of Walter's life, he had shown signs of no longer being as clear-minded as before, that he was forgetful, sometimes confused, and most importantly, that he had become dependent on a young caregiver named Tessa. The witness added that Tessa visited Walter with unusual frequency, more than any other employee, and that the relationship between the two of them was not normal for a caregiver and a patient. Lawford gave a slight nod after every answer, as though each piece of testimony was falling exactly where he wanted it to fall. He built his argument clearly. Tessa Greer wasn't a relative. She didn't share his blood. She had approached a wealthy old man when he was vulnerable, built an unusually close relationship with him, and as a result, inherited almost all of his fortune. The argument sounded tight. It sounded reasonable. It sounded strong enough for the people sitting in the courtroom to begin leaning toward the plaintiff's side. Craig sat more comfortably than ever, one leg crossed over the other, occasionally glancing at Tessa with a satisfied look on his face. Douglas gave a faint nod every time Lawford finished asking a good question. Father and son both believed the first day belonged to them. As for Tessa, she sat silent throughout the entire hearing. She didn't object. She didn't ask to speak. She didn't appear surprised or confused. She sat at the defendant's table, with 3 stacks of documents in front of her, a pen in her hand, her eyes fixed directly on the witness. Every now and then, she wrote a short line in her small notebook. Every now and then, she opened a file, marked a page with a yellow sticky note, then closed it again. No one knew what she was marking. No one knew what she was writing. And no one in the courtroom, not even Lawford, thought that silence was anything other than helplessness. At the end of the hearing, Judge Caldwell turned to Tessa. "Miss Greer, would you like to respond to today's witness testimony?" Tessa stood. The whole room looked at her. Craig leaned slightly forward, waiting. "Not yet, Your Honor. Tomorrow. Only 4 words." Then she sat down. Craig turned to Lawford with a half-smile. Douglas breathed out in relief. Lawford gathered his documents, his face pleased, though still professionally composed. All of them believed Tessa was stalling, because she had nothing in her hands. No one realized that her silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was patience. The kind of patience Walter Greer had taught her on the chair outside the nursing home porch, many years ago. While Tessa was preparing for the second day in court, across the city, Barrett Kincaid was facing a war of his own. Over the past few weeks, Barrett had noticed unusual signs inside the organization. Several transactions didn't match the books. Information about Barrett's schedule had leaked to places that should never have known it. 2 major deals had been blocked by rivals before they could be completed, as if someone had warned them of every move in advance. Barrett wasn't a man easily driven into paranoia. He had built the Kincaid empire with clarity and the ability to read people, not with baseless suspicion. But 14 years earlier, his father had lost everything because he trusted the wrong person. Barrett had survived because he'd never forgotten that lesson. He began tracing it, quietly, patiently, without telling anyone. Barrett personally checked every transaction, every call, every line of messages. He narrowed the list of suspects from dozens of people down to 5, then 3, then 2, then 1. And when the final name appeared, Barrett sat motionless in front of the laptop screen for nearly 10 minutes. Mitchell, his lieutenant, the man who had followed Barrett from the earliest days of rebuilding the organization, when the two of them had only an old car and a few $100s in their pockets. The man Barrett trusted enough to hand over the keys to the safe. 10 years. Mitchell had been selling information to Garrett Holloway for months. Every transaction, every plan, every step Barrett took, Holloway knew in advance, and Mitchell was paid in return, a lot of money, moved through a hidden account he thought Barrett would never find. He was wrong. Barrett called Mitchell to his office that evening. Mitchell walked in the way he always did, comfortable, familiar. He even smiled as he sat down in the chair across from Barrett, just like he had hundreds of times before. Barrett didn't smile. He sat behind the desk, the laptop already open, the screen facing him. Silence. Mitchell waited, still not realizing anything was different. Then Barrett slowly turned the laptop screen toward Mitchell. On it were all the messages between Mitchell and Holloway. Every line, every date, every number. Mitchell looked at the screen. His smile died. The blood drained from his face in less than 2 seconds. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Barrett closed the laptop, slowly. The sound of it shutting was like a hammer striking in the silent room. 10 years, Barrett said, his voice low, not rising, not shaking, not angry, and that calmness was the most frightening thing of all. I shared everything with you. Money, power, trust. The thing I don't give anyone else. Barrett looked straight into Mitchell's eyes. And how much did you sell me for? Mitchell swallowed. His hands began to tremble. Barrett, I can explain. No. 1 word. Mitchell fell silent. Barrett stood slowly, his hand resting on the desk. He looked at Mitchell the way a man looks at someone already dead who simply doesn't know it yet. Mr. Walter once told me something. The first traitor isn't the frightening one. The frightening one is the person you never believed would betray you. Barrett buttoned his suit jacket. I didn't listen to him. That was my mistake. He stepped out from behind the desk and walked toward the door. He stopped, without turning back. You have until tomorrow morning to leave this city. That's the only chance I'm giving you. Then Barrett opened the door and walked out. 2 of his men stepped in after him. Mitchell remained sitting in the room alone, his face white as paper, his hands still shaking. But Barrett didn't know that Mitchell had betrayed him more completely than he had imagined. Before being exposed, Mitchell had sent Holloway one final piece of information, Barrett's movement schedule for that evening, including the underground parking garage on the 3rd level of the office building. Holloway acted immediately. When Barrett entered the parking garage that night, he was with 2 guards as usual. But when the elevator opened on the 3rd level, the 2 guards were blocked in the hallway, leading out to the garage. 3 men stood in their way, separating them from Barrett. It was a trap. Mitchell had arranged everything before Barrett had the chance to call him into the office. Barrett stepped into the parking garage and saw 3 men waiting. They stood between 2 rows of cars, blocking the exit, the neon lights flickering overhead. Barrett stopped, looked at the 3 men, looked around. 2 seconds. He didn't run. Barrett took off his suit jacket, folded it neatly, and placed it on the roof of the nearest car. He rolled his shirt sleeves up to his elbows. Then he stepped forward. Everything happened very fast. Barrett handled the first 2 men cleanly and decisively. But the 3rd man was faster than he had calculated. Barrett was wounded in the left arm before he slammed that man down onto the concrete floor. The parking garage fell silent again. There was only Barrett's heavy breathing and the buzzing of the neon lights above. He stood among the 3 men lying on the ground, his left arm aching, blood soaking through the fabric of his shirt. Barrett picked up his suit jacket, put it back on, and buttoned it with one hand. Then he took out his phone and called Neil. His voice was calm, as if he were calling to confirm a meeting schedule for the next morning. Holloway sent 3 men. Send them back. Let Holloway know that next time, I'll come see him myself. He hung up, slipped the phone into his pocket, and walked out of the parking garage. His left arm was still bleeding, but his steps remained even, his back still straight, his eyes fixed ahead. Barrett Kincaid had lost his father to betrayal. Tonight, he had nearly lost his own life to betrayal too. But unlike his father, Barrett was still standing, and the men who had come for him were not. Tessa had already found the unusual money trail before Barrett contacted her the second time. During the nights she spent preparing for trial, she traced each transaction from Walter's trust fund, compared them against bank statements, and discovered a large sum of money flowing from the trust account through Ridgemont Holdings before disappearing into a complicated network of shell companies. Douglas had withdrawn his father's money, that much she was certain of, but who Ridgemont Holdings belonged to, she still hadn't found. The public business registration records only led to fake names, virtual addresses, and directors who existed on paper. It was the kind of structure she encountered every day in financial fraud investigations. But to peel away the final layer, she needed one more piece of the puzzle. That piece arrived on the afternoon before the second day in court. Barrett texted her. Briefly, just like the last time. An address, a time, nothing more. Tessa arrived exactly on time. Barrett was already sitting in a different coffee shop from the last one. Smaller, emptier, in the western part of the city. She noticed one difference immediately. Barrett's left hand rested on the table a little too stiffly, and beneath the fabric of his suit jacket, his arm was bandaged. Barrett didn't explain. He went straight to the point, his voice low, quick, without a single wasted word. Ridgemont Holdings belongs to Garrett Holloway. Douglas borrowed money from Holloway to save Craig from debt. He didn't know he was getting involved with an underground organization, but unclean money is still unclean money. The court won't care whether Douglas knew or not. Tessa listened, then gave a slight nod. She wasn't surprised. She didn't panic. She had suspected for a long time that there was something wrong with that money trail, and now she had the name. The rest, she could handle herself. I'll find the legal evidence on my own, through federal business registration records and bank statements in the litigation file. I don't need anything else from you. Barrett nodded. Tessa looked at his arm. Were you hurt because of this? Barrett looked down at his own arm, as if he had only just remembered it. I was hurt because I trusted the wrong person. Something else. His voice was flat, but Tessa was sharp enough to recognize that behind the words, something else, was a weight heavier than he wanted to show. She didn't ask more. Barrett stood, buttoning his jacket with one hand, skillfully, as if he had already grown used to it. Before walking away, he stopped. On the final day of the trial, I'll be there. No explanation, no mention of what he would do, just one brief statement, and Tessa understood that it wasn't a promise. It was a warning meant for anyone who still thought they could touch her after the trial ended. On the morning of the second day of trial, the courtroom was more crowded than the day before. Several people had arrived early to save seats, because rumors about the Greer family lawsuit had already spread through legal and financial circles. Lawford walked in with a thick briefcase, his expression just as confident as it had been yesterday. Craig followed behind his father, still wearing that familiar smile. Douglas sat down and glanced toward the defendant's table. Tessa was already seated there, with the same 3 stacks of files in front of her as yesterday. But today, there was one small difference. Each stack had yellow sticky notes already marking specific pages. Judge Caldwell called the hearing to order and asked whether Tessa wanted to respond to the witness testimony from the day before. Tessa stood. Yes, Your Honor. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. Craig leaned forward slightly, more curious than worried. Lawford set down his pen and waited. The judge nodded. Go ahead, Miss Greer. Tessa stepped away from the table, carrying only one file. No notes, no prompt sheets, no prepared speech. She walked straight to the witness stand, where the man who had testified yesterday was sitting, called back at the court's request. The witness looked at Tessa, a little uneasy, but still trying to appear calm. Tessa opened the file. You testified before this court that I visited Mr. Walter with unusual frequency, correct? The witness nodded. Correct. And you specifically named 4 dates on which you claimed I was present at the nursing home, influencing Mr. Walter's decision. Correct? Correct. Tessa took a set of documents from the file and handed it to the court clerk. These are my work records from the auditing firm where I'm employed. The records confirm that on all 4 dates you just named, I was performing an investigation assignment in another state, more than 800 miles from Maplewood Nursing Home. The courtroom went silent. The witness looked at the documents the clerk handed him, his eyes moving quickly across the page. The color of his face changed. Tessa didn't stop. Would you like to review the dates again? The witness swallowed. I may have remembered the dates wrong. You remembered 4 dates wrong? Tessa asked, her voice calm, not mocking, not raised, simply asking, and that calmness was what made the question feel 10 times heavier. The witness didn't answer. Tessa continued, turning to the next page in the file. But there's something interesting. According to the visitor log from Maplewood Nursing Home, a document I requested the court to provide during litigation procedure, on the exact 4 dates you just named, there was one person who visited Mr. Walter. She handed the second document to the court clerk. That person was Craig Greer. Craig, sitting at the plaintiff's table, stopped breathing. The smile disappeared. He looked at Lawford, then at his father, then back at Tessa. Tessa looked directly at Judge Caldwell. Craig Greer stated in the litigation record that he rarely visited his grandfather, but the visitor log shows that he was present on the exact days the witness accused me of being there and exerting influence. So the question is, who actually went to see Mr. Walter on those dates, and who is lying before this court? Craig went pale. Douglas turned to look at his son, and for the first time during the entire trial, the look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was the look of a man beginning to doubt his own side. Lawford flipped through the documents on the table, searching quickly, trying to verify them. But he knew Tessa wasn't the kind of person who presented evidence without checking it thoroughly. Judge Caldwell looked at the visitor log, then at Craig, then made a note in the record. She said nothing, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Tessa wasn't finished. She returned to the defendant's table, picked up another file, then turned back toward the stand. Attorney Lawford argued that I deliberately applied for a job at Maplewood Nursing Home in order to approach Mr. Walter. That is the foundation of the entire manipulation allegation. Lawford sat up straighter. This was the core of his argument. Tessa opened the file. I applied for the position at Maplewood on March 14th. This is a copy of my job application, stamped with the date received by Maplewood's Human Resources Department. She handed the document to the court clerk. Then she took out a second document. Mr. Walter Greer entered Maplewood Nursing Home on June 28th. This is Maplewood's new resident intake record, also stamped with the date. She handed that over as well. Then she turned toward the courtroom, her voice still calm, still slow, still clear with every word. I had been working at Maplewood for more than 3 months before Mr. Walter ever walked through its doors. I didn't seek out Mr. Walter. Mr. Walter came to the place where I was already working. That was a coincidence the plaintiffs have turned into an accusation. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Not loudly, but enough for the judge to tap her bench lightly and call for order. Lawford took the copy of the document the clerk passed to him. He read it, checked the dates. March 14th, June 28th. Correct. Completely correct. He set the document down and looked straight ahead. No objection. Nothing to object to. Craig looked toward Douglas. Douglas didn't look back. He was staring at Lawford, signaling with his eyes, telling him to do something. Lawford ignored him. Not because he didn't want to help his client, but because for the first time in this lawsuit, Martin Lawford, the attorney who had never lost, realized that he was sitting on the wrong side of the courtroom. During the lunch break between the second day of trial and the third, the courthouse hallway was quiet. Most people had gone outside for lunch. Lawford took Douglas and Craig to a restaurant 2 blocks from the courthouse to discuss strategy for the next day. Tessa sat alone on a long wooden bench at the end of the hallway, with a sandwich from the vending machine and a bottle of water in front of her. She ate slowly, her eyes still reading the documents resting on her lap. Craig returned to the courthouse earlier than expected. He walked down the hallway, holding a cup of coffee from the restaurant, his leather shoes tapping evenly against the stone floor. When he saw Tessa sitting there with her cheap sandwich and bottle of water, he stopped. He looked down at her from above. You know you're going to lose, right? Tessa didn't look up. She took another bite of the sandwich, chewed slowly, her eyes still on the document. Craig stepped closer. his voice lower but sharper. "A little maid trying to take the Greer family fortune. Who do you think is going to believe you?" Tessa swallowed the bite of sandwich and answered calmly. "Mr. Walter believed me." Craig gave a cold laugh, dry and forced. The old man was senile. Only then did Tessa look up. She looked straight at Craig, her eyes neither angry nor sad, only so calm that Craig stopped laughing. "I have nothing. That's why I have nothing to lose. But you do." Craig didn't answer. He stood there for one more second, then turned and walked away. His steps were faster than when he had arrived. The coffee cup in his hand tilted slightly, nearly spilling over. Tessa watched him for a moment, then lowered her head and continued reading the documents. On the morning of the third day of trial, the courtroom was more crowded than the first 2 days combined. News about the woman representing herself, tearing apart a witness and catching Craig in a lie before the court, had spread faster than anyone had imagined. Several attorneys from other courtrooms used their break to slip in and sit in the back. The court clerk had to bring in extra chairs. Judge Caldwell called the hearing to order. Tessa stood immediately. "Your Honor, I request permission to present additional evidence." The judge nodded. Tessa walked to the evidence table, where she had already prepared a USB drive and 3 sets of files. She plugged the USB drive into the court's presentation system. The large screen on the wall lit up. "This is security camera footage from Maplewood Nursing Home, lawfully obtained during the litigation process." The video began to play. Walter Greer appeared on the screen, walking down the hallway of the nursing home. His steps were slow but steady. He stopped to greet employees, exchanged a few words, and smiled faintly. In another clip, he sat in the common room reading financial documents, holding a pen as he underlined important lines. In the next clip, he signed paperwork in front of a bank employee, asked about one detail before signing, and corrected a wrong number in the contract. Nothing in the video showed an old man who was no longer clear-minded. The man on the screen was an 82-year-old man who was fully alert, sharp, and in control of every decision he made. Then the video moved to the final clip. Walter was sitting in his private room, the phone pressed to his ear. His voice was clear, firm, without the slightest hesitation. "Douglas, I've already told you. The answer is no. That is my money, and I decide where it goes." Silence followed for a few seconds. Then Walter continued. "If you want to sue, then sue, but don't call me asking for more." He hung up. The courtroom went utterly still. Douglas stared down at the table. Craig sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the screen. Judge Caldwell made a note. Tessa turned off the video, then opened the second set of files. "Your Honor, these are the financial records from Mr. Walter Greer's trust fund, provided by the bank managing the trust under court order." She placed the file on the evidence table. The judge received a copy. Lawford received a copy. "Over the past 8 years, Mr. Walter spent hundreds of thousands of dollars rescuing Craig Greer from bad debts caused by repeated business failures." Tessa turned the pages one by one. The numbers appeared on the presentation screen. The first loan, the second loan, the third, the fourth. Every time Craig fell, Walter paid. The total climbed to a figure that made the courtroom begin to murmur. And according to the records, Craig Greer didn't repay a single dollar. Craig lowered his head. He looked at no one. Douglas was still staring down at the table, but his shoulders had begun to sink. Tessa opened the final file. And this is the last part. A screenshot of a chain of text messages appeared on the screen. Messages Craig had sent to a friend, lawfully extracted through court order during the financial investigation related to the estate. One message stood out above all the others. Craig had written, "When the money comes in, I'll pay off all my debts." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The judge struck her gavel and called for order. Tessa turned toward the courtroom, her voice still as calm as it had been while presenting everything before. This message was sent 2 weeks after Craig Greer filed the lawsuit, seeking to invalidate Mr. Walter's will. It shows that the true motive behind this lawsuit wasn't justice, wasn't family rights, but the fact that Craig Greer was being pressured by creditors and needed the inheritance money to pay his debts. Craig sat as if turned to stone. His face was pale, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Douglas turned to look at his son, and for the first time since the lawsuit began, there was no anger or determination in his eyes. There was confusion. Lawford sat still, his pen resting on the table, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't object. He didn't request more time. He didn't stand and say anything, because there was nothing left to say. Every piece of evidence Tessa presented was like a brick pulled from the wall the plaintiffs had spent 3 weeks building. The video proved Walter was clear-minded. The phone call proved Douglas had pressured him. The financial records proved Craig had been living off his grandfather's money. The text message proved Craig had sued because of debt. And that wall, layer by layer, was collapsing. Judge Caldwell looked over the files on the table, then looked at Tessa. "Miss Greer, do you have any other evidence you need to present?" Tessa stood. "One final piece of evidence, Your Honor." She turned back to the defendant's table and took out a second USB drive. This was the USB she hadn't touched once during all 3 days of trial. She had saved it for this moment. This is the video recording of the process in which Mr. Walter Greer made his will, recorded by probate attorney Harrison at the law office, following the standard legal procedure used when drafting a will for substantial assets in the United States. The video was made to prove that Mr. Walter was fully clear-minded and acting voluntarily at the time he signed the will. The judge nodded her permission. Tessa plugged the USB into the system. The screen lit up, and Walter Greer's voice echoed through the courtroom. He was sitting in a bright, clean, simple room. Across from him sat Attorney Harrison, holding a pen and a set of documents. In the right corner of the screen was the date, about 8 months before Walter died. Walter looked straight into the camera. His eyes were bright, alert, the kind of alertness that belongs to a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why. His voice had grown much older than it had been in previous years, but every word was clear, every sentence coherent. Attorney Harrison asked whether he was making this will voluntarily. Walter nodded. "Completely voluntarily. No one forced me. No one suggested it. This is my decision." Harrison asked whether anyone had influenced him. Walter shook his head. "I'm 81 years old, not 8. I know where my money is going and why." Then Harrison asked the final question. "Mr. Greer, would you like to explain why you chose to divide your estate this way?" Walter was silent for a while. He looked down at his hands, then lifted his eyes to the camera, and when he spoke, his voice was slower, softer, but every word carried so much weight that the entire courtroom seemed to sink beneath it. "I've spent my whole life among people who wanted something from me. Money, connections, power. Everyone wanted something. Everyone took, and I gave, because I thought that was how I could hold a family together." He stopped, breathed. "But I was wrong. Money doesn't hold anyone. Money only holds their shadows." Then he continued, and when he said that name, his voice warmed in a way everyone could hear. "If anyone deserves it, it's Tessa. That girl never asked me for anything. She never treated me like a wallet. She sat beside me every afternoon and listened to me tell stories my son couldn't be bothered to hear, stories my grandson couldn't be bothered to know." Walter looked straight into the camera, as though he knew that one day, this video would be played in a courtroom, in front of the people trying to take back what he had decided to give away. "That girl loved me before she knew what I had. And that's why I'm leaving her the most." The video ended. The screen went dark. The courtroom went utterly still. Not the kind of silence people keep when they're thinking. It was the kind of silence no one dares to break after hearing something like that. Tessa stood beside the evidence table, her eyes straight ahead, but her hand gripped the edge of the table tightly. She didn't cry, but she had to hold on hard to keep herself standing still, because Walter's voice was still echoing in her head, and hearing him speak of her with that warmth, inside a room full of people trying to prove she was a fraud, hurt more than anything Craig or Douglas had ever said. Lawford sat motionless. His eyes closed for a moment after the video ended, then opened again and lowered to the documents in front of him. He didn't need anyone to tell him the case was over. He stood slowly, straightened his tie more out of habit than necessity. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs will no longer continue arguing the issue of undue influence." That sentence fell into the courtroom like a sigh. Not a loud surrender, only a quiet admission that there was nothing left to fight with. Craig lowered his head. Both hands rested on his thighs, his fingers woven together, clenched tight. Douglas stared down at the table, looking at no one, saying nothing. Judge Caldwell made a note in the record, then looked up. "Before the court issues its ruling, there is one matter I need to address." She opened a large envelope, the kind sealed with the stamp of Attorney Harrison's office. Under Mr. Walter Greer's instructions, this letter was to be opened only in the event of a legal dispute involving the will. Since that condition has been met, I will read the contents of the letter before the court. Douglas looked up. For the first time all morning, he looked toward the judge, and there was something new in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, but the instinctive feeling that what he was about to hear would hurt more than any ruling. Judge Caldwell opened the envelope and took out a handwritten sheet of paper. Walter's handwriting, slightly shaky but still readable. She began to read, her voice even, adding no emotion, letting Walter's own words carry their weight. Douglas, I'm writing this letter because I know you'll sue. I know you'll be angry, and I know you'll believe that I'm wrong. But I'm not leaving less to you because I hate you. I'm leaving less because every dollar I give you, you use to save Craig. And every time you save Craig, you're hurting him. You aren't teaching him to stand up. You're teaching him that there will always be someone there to catch him when he falls. And he keeps falling, Douglas. He keeps falling because you never let him hit the ground long enough to stand up on his own. The judge paused for one beat. No one in the courtroom breathed loudly. She continued reading. I want you to understand one thing. Love without limits isn't love. It's indulgence, and it destroys. I've watched it destroy Craig. I don't want to watch it destroy you too. The judge folded the letter and set it down on the table. Douglas sat motionless. His eyes were red, not from anger, but because, for the first time in his life, he had heard his father tell him the truth no one around him had ever dared to say, written in the voice of a man who had loved him enough not to lie, even knowing that truth would wound him. Craig didn't lift his head. He sat there, his shoulders drawn inward, as if trying to make himself small enough that no one would see him. For the first time since the lawsuit began, Craig Greer didn't look like an arrogant man demanding an inheritance. He looked exactly like what his grandfather had written, someone who had never been allowed to hit the ground long enough to stand up on his own. Judge Caldwell set the letter down, adjusted her glasses, and opened the ruling file. The courtroom understood that everything was about to end. Lawford sat still, his pen already put away, his briefcase already closed. Craig still had his head lowered. Douglas stared straight ahead with empty eyes. The judge cleared her throat, preparing to read. At that exact moment, Tessa stood. Your Honor, I have one more request. The courtroom, already silent, became even more silent. Lawford frowned. Craig lifted his head for the first time all morning. Douglas turned to look at Tessa, and something new flashed in his eyes. Not anger, fear. Judge Caldwell looked at Tessa. Miss Greer, the hearing is nearly concluded. What is your request? Tessa stepped to the evidence table and took out the final file. The file she had built herself through those sleepless nights before trial, from the first lead to the legal evidence collected through federal business registration records and bank statements in the litigation file. Your Honor, during the preparation of my defense, I discovered a serious issue involving Mr. Walter Greer's trust fund, outside the scope of the plaintiff's allegations. She placed the file on the table. The judge received a copy. Lawford received a copy. Before Mr. Walter's will was opened, Mr. Douglas Greer withdrew a large sum of money from the trust fund and transferred it through a company called Ridgemont Holdings. This transaction was not disclosed in any litigation document the plaintiff submitted to the court. Tessa turned to the next page, where she had clearly laid out the money trail diagram. I traced Ridgemont Holdings through federal business registration records. This company was created beneath a chain of shell entities, connected to an underground financial organization, operated by an individual named Garrett Holloway. That name fell into the courtroom, like a stone thrown onto still water. Most people didn't know who Holloway was, but one person knew very well, Douglas Greer. His face shifted from white to gray. Tessa continued, her voice still even, still professional, without the slightest trace of personal emotion. Based on what I found, Mr. Douglas Greer borrowed money from Ridgemont Holdings to cover the debts of his son, Craig Greer. He may not have known Ridgemont Holdings was connected to an underground organization, but unclean money is still unclean money, regardless of whether the borrower knew its origin. Craig turned to look at his father. His eyes widened, the eyes of someone gathering broken pieces inside his head and beginning to see a picture he had never expected. Dad knew about this? Douglas didn't answer. Who did you borrow money from? Craig's voice shook, not with anger, but because for the first time, he realized that the father who had always protected him, the man he had trusted completely, had hidden something much larger from him than a loan. Douglas remained silent. He stared straight ahead, not looking at Craig, not looking at Tessa, not looking at anyone. That silence was a clearer answer than any words he could have spoken. Judge Caldwell examined the file, turning each page, reading carefully. Her face showed no expression, but her eyes stopped longer than usual on a few specific lines. Then she set the file down. The court acknowledges this evidence. The financial records related to Mr. Douglas Greer's transactions will be referred to federal investigative authorities for further review. Douglas closed his eyes. At that exact moment, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, only a soft creak and the steady sound of footsteps across the wooden floor. Barrett Kincaid walked in, black suit, neatly combed hair, straight back. His left arm looked slightly stiff beneath the fabric of his jacket, where the wound still hadn't fully healed. 2 men came with him, one on his left, one on his right, walking in step, eyes forward. All 3 sat down in the last row of the courtroom. They said nothing. They looked at no one. Barrett sat straight, both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes facing forward. He didn't need to look at anyone because he knew everyone was looking at him. Lawford was the first to notice. He glanced back, frowned, then turned around again. He didn't know who Barrett was, but his lawyer's instinct told him the 3 men who had just entered weren't ordinary spectators. Craig turned to look but didn't recognize him. But Douglas turned back, and everything changed. Douglas's eyes met Barrett's. The distance was nearly 15 meters, but Douglas could see him clearly. That face, the old watch on his left wrist, the cold calmness. Douglas knew who Barrett Kincaid was. He knew Holloway was Barrett's enemy, and he knew that if Barrett was sitting here, in this courtroom, after Tessa had just mentioned Holloway's name, then Barrett knew everything. He knew about Ridgemont Holdings. He knew about the loan. He knew Douglas had accidentally become entangled in the empire of his enemy. Douglas turned back to the front. His face was whiter than it had been at any moment during the 3 days of trial. Barrett said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence in the courtroom was all that was necessary, a silent reminder that after the trial ended, after the judge read the ruling, after everyone left the courtroom, there was still another world waiting for Douglas outside. Judge Caldwell tapped the bench lightly. The court will now read its ruling. The courtroom went absolutely silent. After reviewing all the evidence presented, the court finds no basis for the plaintiff's allegations of undue influence, coercion, fraud, or lack of legal capacity. The complaint is dismissed in its entirety. Mr. Walter Greer's will is fully valid and shall be executed according to its terms. Craig closed his eyes. Douglas didn't react. The judge continued. In addition, the financial records related to Mr. Douglas Greer's undisclosed transactions will be referred to federal investigative authorities. The plaintiffs shall bear all litigation costs. The gavel came down. The trial was over, and in the last row, Barrett Kincaid stood, buttoned his suit jacket, then walked quietly out of the courtroom before anyone had time to turn back and look. The courtroom gradually emptied. People stood, gathered their things, spoke softly among themselves, then filed out one by one. Craig was the first to leave. He stood the moment the judge's gavel came down, without looking at his father, without looking at Tessa, without saying a word to anyone. He picked up his phone, pushed open the door, and disappeared into the hallway, as if this courtroom were a place he needed to escape as quickly as possible. Lawford gathered his briefcase slowly, calmly, with the kind of calm that belonged to a man who had accepted the outcome before it was ever announced. He stood, put on his coat, and walked past the defendant's table. When he passed Tessa, he stopped for half a beat. He gave her a small nod. He said nothing, but that nod carried something Tessa hadn't expected. Recognition. Then he walked out. The court clerk collected the files, turned off the presentation system, and checked the judge's bench one last time. The last few spectators passed through the door. The footsteps thinned. The door closed. Then came silence. Tessa stood at the defendant's table, placing each stack of documents into her old leather briefcase. She moved slowly, carefully, one file at a time. Not because she needed everything neat, because she needed time. She needed a quiet space for everything that had just happened to settle. 3 days. 3 days in a courtroom, alone against an entire family, a team of attorneys, and accusations heavy enough to crush anyone who hadn't prepared well. And she had stood firm. Tessa closed the briefcase, slung it over her shoulder, and turned toward the door. After a few steps, she suddenly remembered the pen she had left on the evidence table when she presented the final file. She turned back, and only then did she realize Douglas Greer was still sitting at the plaintiff's table. Alone. He sat exactly where he had been since that morning, both hands resting on the table, his eyes lowered to the wood. motionless. Around him, the chairs were empty, the tables were bare, the papers had all been cleared away. Craig had left. Lawford had left. The court staff had left. The courtroom was so wide and empty that the breathing of two people could be heard clearly. Tessa stood about 10 steps from Douglas. She looked at him. Not the way a winner looks at the defeated, but the way a person looks when she unexpectedly recognizes something familiar. Loneliness. She knew what loneliness looked like. She had lived with it all her life. Tessa picked up the pen from the evidence table and slipped it into her bag. She should have walked out. She should have kept going. She should have left Douglas sitting there with the consequences of his own choices. But her feet didn't move. She stood there for a few more seconds. Then the silence broke. Not because of Tessa. Douglas spoke, his voice hoarse, trembling, so low it almost couldn't make it past his throat. "I didn't think you'd become someone like this." Tessa looked at him. Douglas was still staring down at the table. He didn't lift his head, as if he were speaking to the tabletop more than to her. Tessa answered, her voice soft, without bitterness, without blame, without triumph, only truth, "Because you never looked." Douglas closed his eyes. His shoulders sagged a little more, as if that sentence were the final drop, falling into a glass that had been full for a long time. He stayed silent for a very long while. Then he spoke, his voice broken, slow, each word forced through something heavy inside his chest. "Walter, my father, he was right. In the letter." Douglas swallowed. "Every time I saved Craig, I was hurting him. I knew it, but I couldn't stop, because he's my son, and I thought that was what a father was supposed to do." He stopped, breathed, then continued. "And every time I ignored you, I was hurting myself, because I should have seen what my father saw. But I didn't look, because I didn't want to look." The courtroom was empty. Only two people remained. A 60-year-old man sitting at the plaintiff's table, and a 27-year-old woman standing in the aisle. Between them lay a distance of 10 steps, and years of words never spoken. Douglas tried to stand, his hands pressed against the table, shaking, pushing himself up. He managed to rise, a little unsteady. Then he looked at Tessa. For the first time, truly looked, not glancing past her, not looking sideways, not looking down at her, but looking straight into her eyes, as though only now did he see that she was standing there. "I was wrong." 3 words. Only 3 words. But his voice broke when he said them, and Tessa understood that those 3 words weren't something a man like Douglas Greer could say easily. It had taken him a lifetime to arrive here. A lifetime to admit something so simple. Tessa didn't answer. She didn't need to. There are moments when words only make smaller what is happening. This was one of those moments. Douglas took 1 step forward. Then he stopped. His left hand suddenly lifted to his chest. His face twisted, not with emotion, but because his body was reacting to something he couldn't control. His eyes widened, confused, in pain. "Mr. Greer." Tessa dropped her briefcase to the floor and ran to him. Douglas staggered, his hands still clutching his chest, his legs unsteady. Then he fell. His knees hit the floor first, then his whole body collapsed onto the wooden floor of the courtroom. Tessa dropped to her knees beside him. She supported his head and used one hand to call emergency services. Her voice was fast, clear, calm. The kind of calm people only have when they're used to facing situations far harder than a courtroom. County Courthouse, courtroom number 4. A 60-year-old man has collapsed, clutching his chest. "We need an ambulance immediately." She set the phone on the floor, speaker on, then looked at Douglas. He lay there, eyes closed, breathing shallowly, one hand still pressed to his chest. And Tessa, the woman Douglas had called a little maid, the woman he had accused of fraud, manipulation, and exploitation, the woman he had tried to crush in this very courtroom, was kneeling beside him, holding his head off the cold wooden floor, waiting for the ambulance to arrive. Because no matter how Douglas Greer had treated her, in this moment, he was only an old man in pain. And Tessa Greer wasn't the kind of person who left someone to hurt alone. She had once been abandoned. She knew what that felt like, and she wouldn't do that to anyone, not even the man who had tried to destroy her. The ambulance arrived in less than 10 minutes. The paramedics rushed into the courtroom with a stretcher and equipment, quickly lifting Douglas onto it and taking him to the ambulance. Tessa stepped aside, watching them work, her hands still trembling slightly. Craig appeared in the hallway. Someone had called him. He ran after the ambulance, his face deathly pale, his mouth calling Dad again and again. For the first time since the lawsuit began, Craig's voice no longer carried arrogance, no longer carried contempt. There was only fear, real fear, the fear of a son who was about to lose his father. The ambulance doors closed, the siren wailed, the vehicle sped away. Craig followed in his SUV, turning left at the end of the street and disappearing. The courthouse hallway returned to silence. Tessa stepped outside. Afternoon sunlight spread across the courthouse steps, warm but not hot. She stood there alone, her old leather briefcase hanging from her shoulder, watching the stream of cars passing in front of her. She had just won a lawsuit the whole city had been watching. She had just protected the final wish of the most important person in her life. But standing here, in this moment, she didn't feel victorious. She only felt tired and empty. Footsteps sounded behind her. Tessa didn't turn around right away. She heard those footsteps stop a few steps away from her, then fall silent. She turned her head. Barrett Kincaid stood there. Black suit, straight back, his face expressionless as always. He wasn't with the two men who usually came with him. He was alone. The two of them looked at each other. Neither said anything for the first few seconds. Then Barrett lifted his left hand and removed the old watch from his wrist. He looked at the face of the watch, his finger brushing lightly over the scratched, clouded glass. His father's watch. The only thing left from his old life. Then he looked at Tessa. Mr. Walter told me something once. Back then I asked him why he saved me. A strange kid, wounded, lying inside his construction site. Why did he have to care? Barrett stopped. He put the watch back on his wrist. He said, I didn't save you. I saved the man you would become 10 years later. Barrett looked at Tessa, and for the first time since he had appeared in this story, his eyes softened. Not much. Just enough for Tessa to notice. Today I understand what he meant. Tessa said nothing. She stood there, her briefcase on her shoulder, the afternoon light behind her, and her eyes slowly reddened. For the first time, through the whole story, Tessa hadn't cried when she sat on the kitchen floor with $47. She hadn't cried when she was threatened in the dark alley. She hadn't cried when Craig called her a little maid. She hadn't cried when the whole courtroom thought she would lose. She hadn't cried when Douglas collapsed in front of her. But now, standing before a man she barely knew, hearing him repeat Walter's words in a voice where she could hear the truth, Tessa felt her eyes sting. She didn't sob out loud. Her eyes only turned red, and her lashes grew wet. Barrett gave a slight nod. Then he turned and walked away. No promises. No mention of meeting again. Nothing more said. His footsteps moved steadily down the courthouse steps, farther and farther away, then vanished around the corner. Tessa stood there a little longer, then walked toward the parking lot. She opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, set her briefcase on the passenger seat, and fastened her seatbelt. Then she placed both hands on the steering wheel and cried, not because she had won the case, not because Douglas had collapsed, not because of fear or relief or anger. Tessa cried because she missed Walter. She missed the old man who had sat on the nursing home porch every afternoon, reading the newspaper from the last page back to the front, drinking black coffee without sugar, telling stories from the old days in his slow voice and with his bright eyes. She missed his hand holding hers on the final night. She missed the words, "You never needed anyone to recognize you. That's why I trust you." And she cried because she knew that if he were still alive, he would be sitting in that familiar chair, looking at her with those warm eyes, and saying, "I knew it." Tessa sat in the car for a very long time. She let the tears fall until there were no more, then wiped her face, took a deep breath, started the engine, and drove out of the parking lot. Afternoon sunlight stretched long across the road. The city kept moving, cars kept passing, people kept walking. No one knew the woman in the old car had just gone through the 3 longest days of her life, and no one needed to know, because Tessa Greer's worth had never depended on who knew it and who didn't. There are people who live their whole lives without anyone seeing their true value. They are ignored, looked down on, underestimated by the very people who should have loved them most. But a person's worth doesn't live in whether someone else is willing to recognize it. It lives in the way you stand up when no one is there to lift you, the way you keep walking when no one is cheering, and the way you treat others even when they don't deserve it. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving someone else wrong. It's the day you realize you never needed their permission to become yourself. If today's story touched you in any way, Please hit like and share this video so more people can listen. What did this story awaken in you? Have you ever been looked down on and then proved your worth on your own? Write it in the comments. We always want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss new stories every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in the soul every day. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.